In 3 hours, two men who tried to erase me will watch their entire world collapse. But I should probably start from the beginning. From the moment I walked into my own bedroom and caught my husband tangled up with my best friend. From the second his boot shattered my ribs. From the freezing basement where he locked me like trash and told me to reflect on my behavior. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. Couldn't process that the man I'd loved for 7 years was capable of such shocking brutality, such casual cruelty. The truth is, when you discover you've been cheated, lied to, and betrayed by the two people you trusted most in this world, something inside you either breaks completely or transforms into something so much harder, so much colder, that even you don't recognize yourself anymore. They thought I was weak because I forgave them, because I came crawling back with apologies for overreacting, because I played the pathetic wife desperate to save her marriage. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined, was that I was my father's daughter, and Dominic Romano doesn't forgive betrayal. He avenges it. So I smiled and served dinner while secretly gathering evidence of fraud, infidelity, embezzlement, and crimes that would send them to prison for decades. I attended galas on my husband's arm while coordinating with federal prosecutors and financial strategists to orchestrate their complete destruction. And when I finally revealed the truth, when I stood on that stage and exposed every lie, every theft, every moment of their backstabbing family drama to 300 witnesses and a dozen cameras, the humiliation on their faces was more satisfying than anything revenge fantasy I'd ever imagined. They wanted to see me shamed and broken. Instead, they're the ones who lost everything: their freedom, their fortune, their legacy, their dignity. And I'm just getting started, because what happened next makes their arrests look like mercy. In 3 hours, my father's men are going to walk through that door, and everything I thought I knew about love will be shattered forever. But let me rewind to where this nightmare actually started. When I stepped off that plane 2 days early, carrying nothing but excitement and a bottle of his favorite whiskey. I couldn't believe I'd managed to wrap up the Denver deal so fast, and all I wanted was to surprise Christian, maybe cook dinner together like we used to before my career swallowed our evenings whole. The house was dark when I pulled into the driveway, but I saw flickering lights upstairs, candlelight maybe, and my heart did this stupid little flutter because I thought he was being romantic. I was so blind, so pathetically hopeful, clutching that bottle like it was some magic key to reclaim what we'd lost. I pushed open the bedroom door, and the truth hit me like a freight train derailing at full speed. There was Christian, my husband of 7 years, tangled in our sheets with Sophia, my best friend since college, the woman who'd been my maid of honor, who I'd trusted with every secret and insecurity I'd ever had. The betrayal wasn't just shocking, it was suffocating, like someone had reached into my chest and squeezed until there was no air left. Sophia's eyes met mine first, widening with something that looked almost like satisfaction, and I realized in that split second that this wasn't new. This had been happening right under my nose, probably for months, maybe years. Christian scrambled up, not even bothering to cover himself, and the first words out of his mouth weren't an apology, but a justification. "You're never home anyway." Something inside me snapped clean in half. I lunged forward and slapped Sophia across the face, hard enough that my palms stung and her head whipped to the side, hard enough that I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the humiliation burning through my veins. She screamed, clutching her cheek, and Christian, the man who'd vowed to protect me, to honor me, went completely feral. He shoved me backward with both hands, and when I stumbled toward him again, blinded by rage and heartbreak, he actually kicked me. His foot connected with my ribs with a sickening crack that I felt more than heard, and suddenly I was on the floor, gasping, unable to breathe, while pain exploded across my entire torso. "You crazy bitch," he spat, standing over me like I was trash he'd just taken out, while Sophia watched from the bed with her hand still pressed to her reddening face. I tried to get up, tried to crawl toward the door, but Christian grabbed me by the hair and dragged me down the hallway. Every breath felt like knives stabbing between my ribs, and I could taste blood in my mouth from biting my tongue when I fell. He hauled me down the basement stairs. I'll never forget the way my body bounced against each step, each impact sending fresh waves of agony through my broken bones, and threw me onto the concrete floor like a bag of garbage. "You need to calm down and reflect on your behavior," he said, his voice cold and detached, as if I were the one who'd committed some unforgivable sin. Then he slammed the door, and I heard the lock click into place, sealing me in darkness so complete I couldn't see my own hands. The basement was freezing, damp, and utterly lightless. I lay there on the cold concrete, each breath a struggle, feeling something warm and wet spreading across my shirt. Probably blood, maybe internal, I didn't know. My phone had fallen somewhere during the fight upstairs, so I had nothing, no way to call for help, no way to escape. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time became this elastic thing that stretched and contracted with each wave of pain. I thought about dying down there, thought about my mother, and how suddenly she'd been taken from us years ago in what everyone called an accident. I thought about Christian and Sophia upstairs in my bed, probably laughing about how easily they'd disposed of me, and the rage that coursed through me was almost hotter than the pain. That's when I remembered the old landline phone my father had insisted we keep in the basement years ago, back when he still spoke to me, back before I'd chosen Christian and cut Dominic Romano out of my life. I crawled across that floor, inch by agonizing inch, my ribs screaming with every movement, until my fingers found the dusty receiver. There was only one number I could call, one person who had the power and the resources to get me out of this hell, even though we hadn't spoken in 3 years. My father, the man I'd called a monster, the crime boss I'd sworn I'd never become like, the one person I'd burned every bridge to escape, was now my only hope. I dialed the number I'd tried so hard to forget, and when his voice came through the line, rough and concerned and furiously protective, I whispered 4 words that would change everything. "Daddy, I need you." Within minutes, I heard cars screeching outside, men shouting, and the basement door exploding off its hinges as Dominic's crew flooded in like an army responding to a distress signal. And somewhere upstairs, Christian and Sophia were about to discover what real consequences looked like. Dominic's men moved through my house like a tactical unit, efficient and terrifyingly silent. Marco, my father's head of security, scooped me up so gently it almost made me cry, cradling me like I was made of glass while his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. "Boss is waiting in the car," he murmured, and I caught the edge in his voice. These men had watched me grow up, had protected me before I'd rejected that world, and now they were seeing me broken and bleeding because I'd thought I could have a normal life. They carried me past the living room where Christian stood frozen, his face drained of all color as he realized exactly whose daughter he'd just brutalized. Sophia had disappeared, probably fled the moment she heard the commotion, but Christian, stupid, arrogant Christian, actually tried to speak, tried to explain, until my father stepped into view. Dominic Romano didn't need to raise his voice or his fists to terrify people. He just looked at Christian with those cold, calculating eyes that had orchestrated empires and crushed enemies, and my husband literally backed into the wall. "You put your hands on my daughter," Dominic said, each word measured and deadly calm, the kind of calm that precedes hurricanes and executions. I wanted to watch, wanted to see Christian grovel and beg, but Marco was already carrying me out to the waiting SUV, and honestly, the pain was becoming unbearable. The last thing I saw before they closed the door was my father's face, and I'd never seen him look so purely, murderously furious. Not even when rival families had tried to take his territory. Not even when business deals went catastrophically wrong. They rushed me to a private medical center that Dominic owned, the kind of place where doctors didn't ask questions, and medical records disappeared if you needed them to. The physician, Dr. Chen, had kind eyes and steady hands as she examined me, carefully probing my ribcage while I bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. 3 fractured ribs, severe bruising, Possible internal bleeding, she announced, her professional mask slipping just enough to show genuine anger. This wasn't an accident. This was assault. They hooked me up to IVs, gave me something for the pain that made the edges of the world soft and blurry, and for the first time in hours, I could actually breathe without feeling like I was being stabbed from the inside. Dominic sat beside my bed the entire time, holding my hand with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world thought they knew about him. When the morphine kicked in enough for me to think clearly, I saw the expression on my father's face. Pure, concentrated vengeance. "I'll handle this," he said quietly, and I knew exactly what he meant. Christian Hayes would disappear, probably into the foundation of some building project, and no one would ever find enough of him to identify. It was justice in my father's world, swift and absolute and utterly final. But something had shifted inside me during those hours in that basement, something colder and more patient than the immediate satisfaction of watching Christian die. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse but determined. "I don't want him dead. I want him destroyed." Dominic's eyebrows rose, genuine surprise flickering across his features. Destroyed how? I could see his mind already working, calculating angles and possibilities, because he hadn't built a criminal empire by being impulsive. He'd built it by being smarter and more strategic than everyone else. "Everything," I said, the words coming easier now as the plan crystallized in my mind. His money, his reputation, his company, his future. I want him to lose everything he values, piece by piece, and I want him to know I'm the one taking it all away. A slow smile spread across my father's face, the kind of smile that had made prosecutors nervous and rival bosses reconsider their life choices. "Now you sound like a Romano," he said with unmistakable pride. And for the first time since I'd walked through that bedroom door, I felt something other than pain. I felt power returning to my veins like ice-cold electricity. Dominic made a call, and within the hour, a man named Vincent arrived. Sharp suit, sharper mind, my father's financial strategist and the architect behind half the legitimate business acquisitions that had made the Romano Empire untouchable by law enforcement. "We're going to need documentation," Vincent said, pulling out a tablet and already taking notes. "Bank records, communications, anything that shows patterns of fraud or infidelity that we can leverage." I thought about Christian's office, about the laptop he kept in his study, about the way he'd gotten sloppy lately with passwords because he never imagined I'd go looking. "I can get you everything," I promised, and even through the pain medication, I felt the old investigative instincts kicking in. I'd been a forensic accountant before I'd married Christian and quit to support his construction business, and those skills were about to become the weapon that would dismantle his entire existence. I spent 2 weeks recovering in one of Dominic's safe houses, a penthouse overlooking the Chicago skyline, where armed guards rotated shifts and Dr. Chen visited daily to monitor my healing. The ribs were knitting back together slowly, painfully, each breath still a reminder of Christian's boot connecting with my chest. Dr. Chen warned me the fractures would take months to fully heal, but adrenaline and rage are powerful anesthetics. Physical pain was nothing compared to the elaborate performance I was about to execute. Vincent had done preliminary digging and discovered something beautiful. Christian's construction company, Hayes Development, was hemorrhaging money through fraudulent contracts and embezzlement schemes that he'd apparently been running for years. "He's been cooking the books," Vincent explained, spreading financial documents across the dining table like a general planning a siege, skimming from investor funds, overcharging clients, using substandard materials and pocketing the difference. We're talking millions in potential criminal liability. But we needed more than just financial crimes. We needed the complete picture, the kind of evidence that would destroy him in every court that mattered, legal, social, and professional. So I did something that would have horrified the woman I'd been 3 weeks ago. I called Christian and told him I forgave him. My voice shook just enough to sound genuine, broken enough to seem believable. "I overreacted," I lied. tasting bile as the words left my mouth. I shouldn't have hit Sophia. I know you've been stressed with work, and I haven't been present enough in our marriage. The silence on his end stretched so long I thought he'd hung up, but then he exhaled, relief flooding through the phone line. "Baby, I'm so sorry," he said, and the infidelity in his voice made my skin crawl. "Can we talk? Can I see you?" I moved back home 3 days later, playing the role of devoted wife trying to save her marriage. Christian was overly attentive, bringing me flowers and cooking dinners, probably terrified that I'd press charges or, worse, that I'd tell my father the full story of what happened. He didn't know that Dominic's tech team had already wired our house like a surveillance state, cameras and audio recording everything, keyloggers on every computer tracking every password and transaction. Sophia had gone quiet after that night, changed numbers, stopped posting, but Christian couldn't stay away from her. The betrayal was too addictive, the cheating too habitual. Within a week, I had video footage of him sneaking out to meet her at a hotel downtown, audio recordings of them laughing about how easily I'd forgiven him, how pathetic I was for believing his apology. Every night, I'd lie beside him in bed, feeling his weight on the mattress and fighting the urge to vomit. Every morning, I'd kiss him goodbye and watch him drive to work, then immediately call Vincent with updates on new files I'd copied, new emails I'd forwarded to encrypted accounts. Christian kept a laptop in his home office with years of incriminating evidence, altered inspection reports, payoffs to city officials, contracts with shell companies that existed only to funnel money back to his personal accounts. I photographed everything, uploaded it to secure servers, built a digital fortress of proof that would be absolutely impossible for him to deny or destroy. The deeper I dug, the more shocked I became. This wasn't just minor fraud. This was systematic corruption spanning nearly a decade. Then Vincent found something that made my blood run cold. "He's planning to liquidate shared assets," Vincent said during one of our secret meetings at a cafe across town. "He's been consulting with a divorce attorney, preparing to file and claim you abandoned the marriage. He wants to take everything, the house, the savings, even your inheritance from your grandmother, before you can react." The karma of it almost made me laugh. While I was pretending to reconcile and secretly gathering evidence to destroy him, Christian was pretending to reconcile and secretly preparing to rob me blind. We were both playing the same game, but he had no idea he was competing against my father's entire infrastructure of lawyers, accountants, and strategists who'd been perfecting this exact type of takedown for 30 years. "We need to move faster," I told Vincent. My ribs still aching, but my resolve harder than steel. "How quickly can we execute?" He pulled out a timeline on his tablet, showing a cascade of coordinated actions: stock purchases, media leaks, legal filings, regulatory complaints, all designed to converge on a single point of maximum impact. "Hayes Development is hosting their annual investor gala in 2 weeks, Vincent said, his eyes gleaming with the same predatory intelligence I'd seen in my father's face. "Every major stakeholder will be there, all the press, the city council members he's been bribing. If we move then, the fallout will be nuclear." I thought about Christian in his tuxedo, playing the successful entrepreneur, schmoozing with wealthy investors who had no idea their money had been funding his affairs and his fraud, and I smiled for the first time since this whole nightmare began. Vincent worked like a surgeon preparing for the most important operation of his career. We used Dominic's connections to quietly acquire shares of Hayes Development through shell corporations, building positions in the company without triggering any alerts or regulatory filings that would warn Christian something was happening. "We're up to 18% ownership," Vincent reported during one of our strategy sessions, spreading acquisition documents across his desk. "Another 3%, and we can call for a special shareholder meeting, potentially force a vote on leadership." But buying stock was just the foundation. We needed leverage, the kind of information that would make other investors panic sell and crash the company's valuation before we struck the final blow. That's where Christian's own arrogance became his downfall. He'd been so confident in his schemes, so certain he'd never get caught, that he'd left digital trails everywhere. Vincent's forensic team traced payments to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, backtracked altered contracts to their original files showing the real costs versus the inflated invoices, and connected shell company transactions back to Christian's personal accounts through a web of financial relationships he'd thought were untraceable. "This is RICO-level stuff," Vincent said, actually impressed despite himself. "Federal prosecutors would salivate over this evidence. He's not just cheating investors, he's running what amounts to an organized fraud operation." Every revelation made my desire for revenge burn hotter, more focused, more surgical. But the corporate infiltration wasn't just about money. It was about positioning pieces on a chessboard so that when Christian finally realized he was under attack, every escape route would already be blocked. We identified his key allies on the board of directors and began subtle campaigns to undermine their confidence in his leadership. Anonymous tips to the Better Business Bureau about construction defects. Leaked documents to investigative journalists about cost overruns on city contracts. Nothing traceable back to us, just a slow drip of doubt and suspicion that made investors nervous and partners skittish. Christian started having longer, more stressed phone calls with his lawyers and accountants, and I'd watch from across the room, playing the supportive wife, offering him tea and sympathy while secretly recording every word for Vincent's analysis. The night before the gala, Vincent came to the house. Christian thought he was there to discuss the potential investment from Romano Group, which I'd pitched as a way to repair my relationship with my father and bring fresh capital into the company. Christian practically drooled at the prospect of accessing Dominic's money. What he didn't know was that Vincent was actually delivering the final pieces of our attack strategy. A comprehensive dossier of evidence formatted for maximum media impact, prepared remarks for my presentation, and a coordinated schedule of leaks that would hit social media, financial news sites, and regulatory agencies within minutes of each other. My father doesn't work against the system. He knows how to feed it exactly what it needs. "This is going to be spectacular," Vincent said quietly as he handed me a USB drive containing videos, bank records, and audio files that would end Christian's career and possibly his freedom. I held that drive like it was a grenade, feeling its weight and its power. Tomorrow night, in front of 300 investors, business leaders, and journalists, I was going to pull the pin and watch Christian's entire world explode. The company he'd built on lies and fraud would collapse. The reputation he'd cultivated as a successful entrepreneur would shatter. The future he'd planned, divorcing me, taking everything, riding off into the sunset with Sophia, would evaporate like morning mist under harsh sunlight. My father had offered to handle this through violence, to make Christian disappear and solve everything through traditional Romano methods. But this calculated, methodical destruction of everything he valued, this was going to hurt so much more than a bullet ever could. I tried on the dress I'd chosen for the gala, elegant, powerful, blood-red silk that made me look like vengeance personified. Christian saw me in it and whistled appreciatively, completely oblivious. "You look stunning," he said, wrapping his arms around my waist from behind, and I had to suppress the shudder of revulsion that ran through me. "This is going to be our night," he continued, kissing my neck in a way that once would have made me melt, but now just made my skin crawl. "New investments, new beginnings, everything we've worked for." I smiled at our reflection in the mirror, at the doomed man who had no idea he was standing next to the architect of his total annihilation, and thought, "You have no idea how right you are." The Hayes Development Annual Gala was everything Christian had dreamed it would be. Crystal chandeliers, champagne flowing like water, the city's elite mingling in their finest formal wear while a string quartet played in the corner. I walked in on Christian's arm, playing my part perfectly, smiling at investors and making small talk about market trends and construction projects. Dominic had arrived with his own security detail, playing the role of wealthy investor considering putting money into Christian's company, and watching my father shake hands with the man who'd broken my ribs was almost more than I could bear. But I kept my expression neutral, kept my performance flawless, because I knew that in exactly 47 minutes, this entire evening was going to become Christian's worst nightmare. The speeches were scheduled for 8 o'clock. Christian was supposed to present the company's annual results, talk about future projects, and announce new partnerships. He was backstage, reviewing his notes and probably rehearsing his fake humility routine when I approached the event coordinator with a last-minute change. "Mr. Hayes wants me to introduce him," I said smoothly, channeling every ounce of authority I'd learned from watching my father command rooms full of dangerous men. He thought it would be meaningful, given that we're celebrating not just business success, but family partnership with Romano Group's potential investment. The coordinator, already stressed and overwhelmed, just nodded and updated the program without question. Nobody suspected the dutiful wife of harboring anything more dangerous than mild stage fright. When they called my name, I walked onto that stage with the USB drive in my hand, and Vincent's tech team already standing by to hijack the presentation screens. Christian was watching from the wings, probably assuming I'd give some sweet, brief introduction before handing him the spotlight. Instead, I stepped up to the microphone, looked out at 300 expectant faces, and said the words I'd been rehearsing for 2 weeks. "Good evening. My name is Hallie Romano Hayes, and I'm here tonight to tell you the truth about the man you've been investing in." The confused murmurs started immediately, and I saw Christian's face go from puzzled to panicked as the first images appeared on the screens behind me. Video footage from the hotel where Christian met Sophia, crystal clear, time-stamped, utterly damning. Their embraces in the parking garage, their kisses in the lobby, their betrayal documented in high-definition clarity that made several investors gasp audibly. "This is my husband," I continued, my voice steady despite my heart pounding like a war drum, "with my former best friend. But infidelity is just the beginning of what Christian Hayes has been hiding from you." I clicked to the next slide, and bank records filled the screen. Offshore accounts, wire transfers, systematic embezzlement spanning 7 years and totaling over $15 million. These are funds that should have gone to construction projects, to investor dividends, to building the company you all believed in. Instead, they went here. Another click, showing luxury purchases, trips to Monaco and Dubai, a secret apartment he'd bought for Sophia. Funding a lifestyle of lies while you trusted him with your money. The room erupted. Investors were on their feet, some shouting questions, others already on their phones calling lawyers. Christian tried to rush the stage, but Dominic's security blocked him, and the cameras kept rolling as I revealed more. Audio recordings of him instructing foremen to use cheaper materials than specified in contracts, emails discussing bribes to building inspectors, falsified safety reports on projects that could literally collapse and kill people. "The developments you've invested in?" I said, my voice cutting through the chaos like a blade. "They're death traps built on fraud and held together with corruption." I played one final audio clip, Christian and his father Garrett discussing how to hide the latest round of embezzlement, and watched investors' faces transform from shock to fury to sheer panic as they realized how deeply they'd been betrayed. The stock price started crashing before I even left the stage. Vincent sent me real-time updates on my phone. Down 15%, down 23%, down 40%, as media outlets picked up the story and broadcasted the scandal nationwide. Hayes' development was in freefall, and we hadn't even executed the second phase of the plan yet. Christian was surrounded by investors demanding explanations, lawyers advising him to say nothing, journalists shoving microphones in his face asking if he had any comment on the allegations of fraud and infidelity. I walked through the chaos like a queen surveying a conquered battlefield, and when Christian finally broke free and grabbed my arm, his face was a mask of humiliated rage and desperate confusion. "What have you done?" he hissed, and I smiled at him. A real smile, cold and sharp and utterly satisfied. Before saying the words I'd waited 2 months to deliver, I chose myself. The financial collapse was even more spectacular than Vincent had predicted. By Monday morning, Hayes Development stock had cratered 78%, wiping out hundreds of millions in market value as investors dumped shares in blind panic. Federal investigators announced they were opening an inquiry into the fraud allegations, and the Securities and Exchange Commission froze Christian's personal accounts pending investigation. Vincent executed the hostile takeover exactly as planned. Romano Group and its shell company network now controlled 34% of Hayes Development, making us the largest shareholder block and giving us effective control over the board of directors. Christian's desperate attempts to rally support failed spectacularly because nobody wanted to be associated with a company under federal investigation for systematic fraud and corruption. The media leaks had destroyed not just the company, but Christian's personal reputation in ways money could never repair. His face was plastered across financial news networks with headlines screaming about cheating, lying, embezzlement, and the shocking revenge executed by a wife he'd brutalized and betrayed. Vincent had coordinated the story release brilliantly. Interviews with investigators who'd reviewed our evidence, statements from former employees about the toxic work environment and fraudulent practices, even footage from the gala showing Christian's public humiliation. Every news cycle brought fresh revelations, fresh evidence, fresh reasons for the public to despise him. The court of public opinion had convicted him before any legal proceedings even began. Christian started calling me dozens of times a day, leaving voicemails that devolved from angry accusations to desperate pleas. "Hallie, please, we can work this out," he begged in one message, his voice cracking. "I made mistakes, I know, but this is destroying everything. My father's legacy, the company, our future." I deleted each voicemail without listening to the end, feeling absolutely nothing but cold satisfaction. He'd locked me in a basement with broken ribs and told me to reflect on my behavior. Now he could reflect on his own from whatever prison cell or bankruptcy court he ended up in. The justice of it was almost poetic. He'd tried to take everything from me, and instead, I'd taken everything from him. But then Vincent discovered something that made the entire revenge even sweeter and more complex. "You need to see this," he said, arriving at my father's penthouse with a file folder marked confidential. Inside were bank statements showing regular payments from someone named Garrett Hayes, Christian's father, the founder of Hayes Development, to Sofia Rodriguez. $50,000 every month for the past 3 years. Why would his father be paying my former best friend? I asked, though dark suspicions were already forming in my mind. Vincent pulled out more documents, medical records, private investigator reports, DNA test results that Garrett had apparently commissioned and then tried to bury. "Because Sophia's pregnant," Vincent said quietly, "and the baby isn't Christian's." The shocking revelation hit me like a physical blow. Sophia's pregnancy, which she'd announced to Christian last month as the reason they needed to finally be together, wasn't the result of their affair at all. The child was Garrett's. Christian's own father had been sleeping with Sophia for years, paying her off to keep quiet, and apparently planning to let Christian believe the baby was his. "This is deeper than we thought," Vincent continued, pulling out more evidence. "Garrett Hayes has been embezzling even more than Christian, using his son's company as a personal bank account while positioning himself as the respectable patriarch. The corruption goes back almost to the company's founding." The layers of betrayal were almost incomprehensible. Christian had been cheating with Sophia, not knowing she was also sleeping with his father, while Garrett orchestrated financial crimes that made Christian's fraud look like petty theft. I thought about how to use this information, how to maximize the destruction. Christian deserved everything coming to him, but Garrett, the man who'd enabled and encouraged his son's worst behaviors, who'd built a business empire on lies and exploitation, he deserved exposure too. "When's Garrett's birthday celebration?" I asked Vincent, remembering that the Hayes family always threw an elaborate party for the patriarch's birthday, inviting everyone important in Chicago's business and political circles. Vincent checked his phone, a slow smile spreading across his face. 2 weeks from Saturday, black tie event at their estate, 300 guests, all the city's power players. Perfect. Christian's public humiliation had been the opening act, but I was about to deliver a finale that would destroy the entire Hayes family legacy and make sure everyone knew exactly how deep the betrayal and corruption went. Over the next 2 weeks, Vincent's team gathered every piece of evidence about Garrett's crimes: falsified construction plans that endangered lives, Swiss bank accounts holding nearly $40 million in stolen investor funds, payoffs to city council members and building inspectors, and of course the DNA results proving he'd impregnated his son's mistress. We compiled it all into an airtight presentation, complete with documentation that would stand up in any courtroom and testimony from witnesses we'd convinced to cooperate in exchange for immunity. I practiced my delivery, imagining Garrett's face when I revealed his secrets to everyone he'd spent decades trying to impress and manipulate. Christian's downfall had been satisfying, but this was going to be legendary. Garrett Hayes' 75th birthday party was exactly the kind of ostentatious display I'd expected. Ice sculptures, a live orchestra, waiters circulating with champagne that probably cost more per bottle than most people's monthly rent. I arrived on Vincent's arm, playing the role of Romano Group's representative interested in acquiring Hayes Development's remaining assets now that the company was in crisis. Garrett greeted us warmly, probably seeing me as just another investor he could charm and manipulate, completely unaware that I was the architect of his son's destruction and about to become the architect of his own. Christian was there too, looking haggard and desperate, clearly attending only because Garrett had demanded it for appearances. Our eyes met across the room, and the hatred in his expression was almost palpable. Sophia was noticeably absent, probably warned by Garrett to stay away from any public events that might connect her to the Hayes family scandal. But her presence wasn't necessary. The evidence spoke loudly enough without her. I waited until after dinner, until Garrett stood to give his traditional birthday speech thanking everyone for their friendship and support, before I made my move. Actually, Mr. Hayes, I have a presentation I think everyone here should see, I said, standing smoothly and gesturing to Vincent, who was already setting up the projector system we'd arranged with the estate's technical staff. Garrett looked confused but smiled indulgently, probably assuming this was some kind of investor pitch. Of course, my dear. The floor is yours. The first slide showed construction plans, 2 versions side by side. These are the approved plans for the Riverside Luxury Condominiums project, I explained, my voice carrying clearly across the silent room. And these are the actual plans used in construction. The differences were stark. Load-bearing walls removed, cheaper materials substituted, safety systems eliminated. Garrett Hayes personally approved these changes to save money, knowing they violated building codes and endangered lives. 3 people died when a balcony collapsed at Riverside last year. This is why. Gasps rippled through the crowd, and I saw Garrett's face drain of color as he realized what was happening. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. The next slides showed bank statements, wire transfers, a web of financial crimes that made Christian's embezzlement look amateur by comparison. Over 20 years, Garrett Hayes has stolen nearly $43 million from investors, employees, and city contracts. He's hidden the money in Swiss accounts under his wife's maiden name, used shell companies to launder funds, and bribed at least 15 city officials to overlook violations and approve fraudulent projects. I played audio recordings of Garrett ordering subordinates to falsify reports, to hide safety violations, to pay off inspectors. The room was in complete chaos now, with city council members who'd taken his bribes trying to slip out quietly and investors demanding explanations. Garrett tried to speak, tried to deny everything, but his voice was drowned out by the outrage. Then I played the final card, the revelation that would shatter not just his business legacy but his family. And finally, there's this, I said, displaying the DNA results on the screen. Sofia Rodriguez, the woman Christian has been having an affair with, is pregnant. But the child isn't Christian's. It's Garrett's. I let that sink in. watched Christian's face as betrayal and humiliation compounded into something that looked like complete psychological collapse. Garrett Hayes has been paying Ms. Rodriguez $50,000 monthly for 3 years to maintain their relationship and keep quiet about the pregnancy. He was apparently planning to let his own son raise his child, never knowing the truth. The room exploded into absolute pandemonium. Christian launched himself at his father, years of manipulation and lies crystallizing into pure rage. They crashed into the dessert table, throwing punches while guests screamed and scattered. Security tried to intervene, but the damage was done. The Hayes family was publicly, spectacularly destroying itself in front of Chicago's elite. Garrett was shouting that Christian had always been weak, that he'd had to clean up his son's messes for years. Christian was screaming about betrayal and lies, about how his own father had slept with his mistress. It was beautiful chaos, the kind of complete family implosion that money and reputation could never recover from. I stood back and watched it all unfold, feeling absolutely no guilt, no remorse, only the cold satisfaction of justice finally, brutally served. Federal agents arrived at the party before security could even separate Garrett and Christian. Apparently, Vincent had coordinated with prosecutors to time the arrests for maximum impact. Multiple agencies had been building cases based on our evidence, and they'd been waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I watched as FBI agents handcuffed both Hayes men, reading them their rights, while journalists who'd been covering the birthday celebration captured everything on camera. Garrett Hayes, Christian Hayes, you're under arrest for wire fraud, conspiracy, bribery, and reckless endangerment, the lead agent announced, his voice cutting through the chaos. You have the right to remain silent. The rest of his words were drowned out by camera shutters clicking and reporters shouting questions. Sophia was arrested the same night at her apartment, charged as a co-conspirator in the embezzlement scheme. Apparently, she'd been more involved than just sleeping with both Hayes men. She'd helped launder money through shell companies and forge documents. The karmic symmetry of it was almost too perfect. The woman who'd betrayed our friendship, who'd helped destroy my marriage, was now facing federal prison time alongside the men she'd manipulated and been manipulated by. All 3 of them were locked up pending trial, unable to make bail because prosecutors argued they were flight risks with access to millions in hidden overseas accounts. The justice system, for once, was working exactly as it should. Hayes Development's board of directors held an emergency meeting the following Monday and voted unanimously to accept Romano Group's acquisition offer. The company that Garrett had built through fraud and that Christian had driven into the ground was now officially property of my father's empire. Dominic restructured everything immediately, brought in legitimate contractors, fixed the safety violations, established compensation funds for victims of the Riverside collapse and other Hayes projects that had cut corners. We're going to run this company the right way, my father told me, pride evident in his voice. Make it what it should have been all along. He offered me a position as chief compliance officer, overseeing the transformation, and I accepted without hesitation. The trial was a media circus that lasted 3 months. Prosecutors presented our evidence piece by piece, building an absolutely airtight case against all 3 defendants. Christian's lawyers tried to argue he'd been manipulated by his father, but the recordings of him personally ordering fraud undermined that defense. Garrett's attorneys attempted to claim everything was a misunderstanding, but $43 million in hidden bank accounts told a different story. Sophia tried to cooperate for a reduced sentence, but she'd been too deeply involved in too many crimes for prosecutors to offer meaningful leniency. In the end, the verdicts were unanimous. Guilty on all counts. The sentencing was everything I'd hoped for and more. Garrett received 35 years in federal prison, essentially a life sentence at his age. Christian got 22 years, with possibility of parole after 15. Sophia received 12 years. They were led away in shackles, their expensive suits and designer clothes replaced with prison jumpsuits, their futures reduced to decades behind bars paying for their betrayal, fraud, and cruelty. I sat in the courtroom gallery, watching justice being served, and felt something I hadn't experienced since before that horrible night when I came home early from Denver. Peace. They couldn't hurt me anymore. They couldn't hurt anyone anymore. But the story didn't end with their imprisonment. Vincent and his research team had uncovered something else, something that explained so much about my mother's death years earlier. Your mother, Hallie Romano, died in a car accident 8 years ago, Vincent said, presenting me with files I'd never seen before. But it wasn't an accident. We found evidence that Garrett Hayes and his business partner Leland Vance orchestrated it. My mother had been an investigative journalist before she married Dominic, and apparently, she'd been researching Hayes Development's corruption, getting close to exposing everything. They cut her brake lines, Vincent said quietly, made it look like mechanical failure. Your father always suspected, but he could never prove it, until now. The revelation about my mother's murder hit me harder than anything else in this entire nightmare. Hallie Romano had died when I was 19, and I'd spent years believing it was just a tragic accident, random bad luck that had stolen her from us. Learning that Garrett Hayes had ordered her execution because she'd gotten too close to the truth, that her death had been calculated, planned, bought and paid for like any other business transaction, ignited a rage in me that even Christian's betrayal hadn't fully awakened. Leland Vance is still alive, Vincent told me, pulling up information on Garrett's former partner who'd quietly retired to Florida 5 years ago. And with Garrett in prison, he might be willing to testify in exchange for immunity. Dominic and I flew to Tampa, where Leland lived in a waterfront mansion bought with money stolen from the same investors and projects that had funded his crimes with Garrett. The old man was in his 80s now, battling cancer, and when we confronted him with evidence of his involvement in my mother's murder, something broke in him. Maybe guilt, maybe fear of dying without confession, maybe just the reality that he had nothing left to lose. Garrett ordered it, Leland admitted, his voice weak but clear. Your mother had documents, proof of everything. We couldn't let her publish. He gave a full statement, recorded and witnessed by lawyers, detailing exactly how they'd planned and executed the murder, how they'd paid off the mechanic who cut the brake lines, how they'd bought the police investigation to ensure it was ruled an accident. Armed with this testimony and the supporting evidence Vincent's team had uncovered, prosecutors brought new charges against Garrett Hayes: first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, witness tampering. His existing sentence was effectively meaningless now. He'd die in prison regardless, but at least the truth about what he'd done to my mother would be part of his official record, part of his permanent legacy. The trial for Elena's murder was shorter than the fraud trials, because Leland's testimony was devastating and corroborated by forensic evidence that investigators had missed the first time. The guilty verdict came back in less than 4 hours, and Garrett was sentenced to life without possibility of parole, to be served consecutively with his existing sentence. I visited my mother's grave after the verdict, bringing flowers and finally able to tell her that justice had been served. They can't hurt anyone else now, Mom, I whispered, kneeling on the grass above where she was buried. And I'm going to make sure Hayes Development, everything they built on lies and blood, becomes something good, something you would have been proud of. Dominic stood beside me, his hand on my shoulder, and I realized that in trying to escape my father's world of violence and revenge, I'd actually needed to embrace it, to use its tools and resources to protect myself when everything else failed. The Romano family wasn't just about crime and power. It was about loyalty, protection, and making sure that people who hurt our family faced consequences. I restructured Hayes Development completely over the following year. We established victim compensation funds totaling over $60 million for families affected by the company's corruption, including a substantial trust for the families of those who died in the Riverside collapse. We implemented industry-leading safety protocols, hired independent inspectors to audit all ongoing projects, and committed to transparency that was unprecedented in the construction industry. Former employees who'd been pressured into illegal activities by Garrett and Christian were offered immunity in exchange for testimony and cooperation in making the company legitimate. Hayes' development became a model for ethical business practices, proof that even an empire built on lies could be transformed into something meaningful. The board voted to rename the company Romano Development, symbolizing the complete break from the Hayes legacy and the beginning of something new. They offered me the CEO position, which I accepted with my father's blessing, and Vincent's continued support as CFO. At 34 years old, I was running a billion-dollar corporation, employing thousands of people, and using the platform to advocate for construction industry reforms and corporate accountability. The woman who'd been locked in a basement with broken ribs had become one of the most powerful executives in Chicago, and every day I walked into that office was a reminder that survival wasn't just about enduring, it was about transforming pain into purpose. Vincent and I had grown close during the months of planning and executing the takedown of the Hayes family. What started as a professional relationship, him as my father's strategist, me as his client seeking revenge, evolved into something deeper, something built on mutual respect and understanding. He'd seen me at my most broken and my most ruthless, had stood beside me through every revelation and every victory, and never once judged me for choosing the path I'd chosen. 6 months after the final trial concluded, he took me to dinner at the restaurant where we'd planned our first strategy session, and over wine and candlelight, he asked me to marry him. "I've watched you rebuild yourself and an entire company," he said, his voice steady and sincere. "I want to build a future with you." I said yes, not because I needed rescuing or protection, but because I genuinely loved him. Loved his brilliant mind, his unwavering support, his ability to see me as more than just Dominic Romano's daughter or Christian Hayes' ex-wife. We married quietly 6 months later, a small ceremony at my father's estate with just family and close friends, nothing like the elaborate wedding I'd had with Christian. This time, there were no illusions, no performances, just two people who'd been through hell together choosing to build something honest and real. Dominic walked me down the aisle, and when he placed my hand in Vincent's, I saw tears in my father's eyes for the first time since my mother's death. Not long after the wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. The timing felt almost poetic. New life growing inside me while I was rebuilding a company and a future from the ashes of betrayal and revenge. Vincent was ecstatic, immediately going into protective mode and insisting I cut back my hours at the office. But I refused to slow down, refused to let pregnancy become a reason to step back from the work I'd committed to doing. I announced the pregnancy at a company board meeting, watching the directors' faces light up with genuine happiness, and felt overwhelmed by how different this was from the life I'd imagined with Christian. That future had been built on lies and would have crumbled eventually. This future was built on truth, on choices I'd made consciously and deliberately, on reclaiming power that had been stolen from me. The baby kicked inside me while I stood at the podium announcing Romano Development's first annual Ethics and Safety Award, given to employees who demonstrated exceptional integrity in their work. The baby kicked while I signed partnership agreements with victims' advocacy groups, committing resources to prevent the kind of tragedies that Garrett's corruption had caused. The baby kicked while I reviewed financial reports showing the company's first profitable quarter under legitimate practices, proving that you didn't have to cheat and lie to succeed. Each movement was a reminder that I was creating something new, something untainted by the Hayes family's legacy of betrayal and violence. Christian sent a letter from prison, forwarded through multiple attorneys because I'd blocked all direct communication. I almost threw it away unread, but curiosity got the better of me. "I'm sorry," he'd written in shaky handwriting that suggested either poor prison conditions or genuine emotional breakdown. "I destroyed everything. Our marriage, my father's company, my own future. I think about what I did to you every day. I think about how different things could have been if I'd just been honest, if I'd valued what we had instead of throwing it away for cheap thrills and easy money. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just wanted you to know that you were right to do what you did. I hope you're happy now." I read it once, felt absolutely nothing, and then burned it in the fireplace of our new home, watching the paper curl and blacken and disappear into ash. Sophia sent no letters, made no attempts at contact. Through legal channels, I learned she'd given birth to a baby girl in prison, Garrett's daughter, Christian's half-sister, a child born into the most twisted family drama imaginable. Social services placed the baby with Sophia's mother, who apparently had no idea about any of the fraud or affairs until the arrests happened. I felt a moment of pity for that child, innocent and blameless, yet permanently connected to such a legacy of lies. I set up a trust fund for her education, anonymous and untouchable, ensuring that whatever else happened, she'd have opportunities her biological parents had destroyed for themselves. It wasn't forgiveness. I'd never forgive Sophia for what she did. But neither would I punish a child for her parents' sins. On a sunny Tuesday morning, exactly 2 years after Christian had locked me in that basement, I stood in front of Romano Development's headquarters with my father beside me and my hand resting on my pregnant belly. We were unveiling a new memorial, a beautiful marble statue of my mother, Elena Romano, with a plaque dedicating the building to her memory and her commitment to truth and justice. "She would have been so proud of you," Dominic said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taken everything they tried to destroy and turned it into something she would have fought for." Reporters captured the moment. Journalists wrote stories about the remarkable transformation of a corrupt company into an industry leader, but none of them could fully capture what this meant to me personally. I'd started from absolute bottom, broken ribs, locked in darkness, betrayed by everyone I'd trusted. I'd considered giving up, considered just letting my father handle everything through violence and disappearances that would have been easier, but ultimately hollow. Instead, I'd chosen the harder path: strategic patience, methodical evidence gathering, and systematic dismantling of everything my enemies had built. The revenge had been slower, but infinitely more satisfying than any quick act of violence could have been. Christian and Garrett didn't just lose their freedom, they lost their reputations, their legacies, their very identities as successful businessmen. They'd be remembered forever as frauds, cheaters, and criminals. The company thrived under ethical leadership, proving that integrity and profit weren't mutually exclusive. We won industry awards for safety innovation, for worker compensation programs, for community investment initiatives. Former competitors approached us for partnerships, wanting to be associated with the Romano Development brand and everything it now represented. Investors who'd lost money in the Hayes Development collapse got substantial returns through our Victim Compensation Fund, and many of them reinvested in the new company, believing in the transformation we'd achieved. We were building things that would last, projects that wouldn't collapse because corners had been cut or safety had been sacrificed for profit. But beyond the business success, beyond the revenge and the justice and the public vindication, what mattered most was the personal transformation I'd undergone. I'd discovered strength I didn't know I possessed, learned skills I'd never imagined I'd need, and found out exactly what I was capable of when pushed beyond every reasonable limit. The woman who'd married Christian Hayes had been naive, trusting, willing to sacrifice her own career and identity for someone else's dreams. The woman I'd become, Hallie Romano, was nobody's victim. I'd reclaimed not just my father's name, but everything it represented: power, loyalty, and the absolute certainty that anyone who betrayed our family would face consequences they couldn't escape or outlast. Vincent came up behind me, wrapping his arms around me and the baby, and together we looked at the statue of my mother. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked quietly. "Going through all of this instead of just walking away?" I considered the question seriously, thought about the easier path I could have taken, divorcing Christian quietly, moving on, letting prosecutors handle everything without my involvement. But that wouldn't have been justice. That would have been letting them off easy, letting them potentially escape consequences through legal loopholes and expensive attorneys. "Not for a second," I answered honestly. They needed to know I did this. They needed to understand that every single thing they lost was because I chose to destroy them. The baby kicked hard, as if agreeing with my assessment, and I laughed despite myself. This child would grow up knowing a different world than I had, one where their mother was strong, where their grandfather was reformed and legitimate, where family meant protection rather than exploitation. They'd inherit a business built on integrity rather than fraud, a legacy earned through hard work rather than stolen through corruption. And if anyone ever tried to hurt them the way Christian and Garrett had tried to hurt me, they'd learn exactly what happened to people who crossed the Romano family. Because I'd proven that revenge wasn't just about immediate violence, it was about patience, strategy, and the absolute commitment to ensuring that justice, however long it took, would eventually be served. So that's my story. From broken ribs in a basement to boardroom power. From ultimate betrayal to absolute justice. I went from being a woman my husband thought he could discard like garbage to becoming the CEO of the empire built on his family's ruins. Every morning, I wake up next to a man who respects me, carrying a child who'll inherit a legacy of strength instead of lies, running a company that actually helps people instead of exploiting them. But I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between quick revenge and the long game that destroys everything your enemies value? Have you experienced betrayal so deep it fundamentally changed who you are? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because I know I'm not the only one who's had to reclaim their dignity and self-worth after someone tried to humiliate them into silence. And here's what I really want to know. If you caught your partner cheating with your best friend, would you have the patience to smile in their faces while secretly building the case that would send them to prison? Or would you burn it all down immediately? Let me know what you would have done differently, what you think I should have done, whether you think I went too far or not far enough. If stories like this resonate with you, if you believe in justice, karma, and payback for people who think they're untouchable, then subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Because I've got more stories about family betrayal, shocking revelations, and women who refuse to stay victims. And trust me, what I've shared today is just the beginning of understanding how deep vengeance can cut when you're patient enough to let it.